Hi, thanks for being part of this podcast. This is the Apologist Bookshelf, and I'm Gary Zacharias. I thought I'd go back for a third look at a book simply titled Theistic Evolution, subtitle is Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. And boy, I tell you, some of the people involved, J.P. Moreland, Stephen Meyer, Anne Geiger, I guess it's pronounced, and Wayne Grudem, some really quality people. I heard that they weren't expecting this to sell a lot of copies. It was supposed to be too intellectual for the average person, but everybody likes looking at things about creation and evolution and how do we get here, and it's just a naturally interesting area to pursue. And so this book, despite its size, it is hefty. It's over 1,000 pages, I think. It's close to 1,000 anyway. Let's see. Yeah, it gets right up to it. Yeah, about 1,000 pages, thicker than a couple of bricks, and it is excellent. I mean, you can like pick and choose areas that you care about. I worked my way through the whole thing. I found it all fascinating because I love science. So I thought maybe this time we'd look at chapter 23. It's titled Theistic Evolution and the Problem of Natural Evil, not man-made evil, but natural evil. Gerrit de Vries is the author. And the summary, I like this. Every section has a summary, and then it goes into the details. So it starts off defining what he's talking about. So natural evil is the pain and suffering that we get because of natural processes like tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and things like that. Now that's in contrast to moral evil, which are acts of people who know better and do something terrible. And he says that the amount of suffering that we get in this world due to all these disasters that happen seems to show, at least to some people, that how could you get a good God, an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God? That's impossible, or at least highly improbable. So he says, until recently, Christians who were theologians and philosophers and apologists all thought it was important to show that God wasn't responsible for this suffering and death caused by natural evil. But he said there were conservative Christians who had embraced theistic evolution. Remember, this whole book actually is a critique, right? So it's showing the shortcomings and weaknesses of theistic evolution. So he said conservative Christians who had embraced theistic evolution didn't think that they had to insulate God from direct responsibility for all these evils out there. So if natural evil is part of the evolutionary history, and if God's the one who had instituted and set up evolution, then it follows, doesn't it? God's the direct cause of natural evil. He set it up this way. It's part of his plan. But Dewey says opponents who are opposed to theistic evolution have really better explanations of natural evil, and that do not make God the cause of all the pain and death. So he starts off mentioning natural evil, and he just gives some examples. Earthquake and tsunami that came about in Indonesia back in '04 killed 230,000 people. That's just horrifying. In 2010 in Haiti, there was a 7.0 earthquake, 300,000 dead, 300,000 injured, 1 million people homeless. AIDS. An estimated 25 million people dead due to AIDS, 14 million orphaned just in southern Africa. And he said we could go on and on, the grief and the suffering and the fear. And they said that's a real challenge to the Christian theist. How is it that God, who creates the whole universe, he must be directly responsible for this evil? Doesn't this show that an omnipotent, omniscient God, that would be impossible? He says that's the problem of natural evil. So he said, think about that word evil, right? We're calling events evil. He said he's going to use that. He said it's a traditional terminology. So he'll say, let me stipulate, what's natural evil? It's an event that causes serious physical and mental injury to a sentient creature. It's not caused directly by a moral agent, and it's not a cause of useful pain, like put your hand on a fire and you realize you got to get your hand out of there. So it says it's natural evil would be things like natural disasters, but animal suffering. like maybe a fawn gets hurt in a forest fire and has pain before dying, and things like a tornado that knocked down a tree and a person's walking underneath it. Even though maybe they should have gotten rid of the tree, they knew it was rotting and not shouldn't be there. So he said, until recently, theologians, Christians, really had two strategies, and both were designed to show that God was not responsible for the suffering and death that came about through these natural causes. Now, what are we getting here? It's called a theodicy that tries to explain what God's reasons are to allow evil. But he said then you could do a defense. That's more modest, just tries to offer at least a logical possible reason why God might have allowed evil. So he said, now we got a problem out here. A lot of conservative Christians are embracing theistic evolution, and they don't think it's necessary to insulate God from responsibility. And he says again, if natural evil is part of evolution, and if evolution is what God set up, process, then God's the cause. It's part of his plan. So then he lays out what he wants to do in this chapter, to survey, first of all, the response of theistic evolution to the problem of natural evil, and he wants to show that it's pretty inadequate. Then he wants to tell about creation responses, creationists, and then a third response, he calls it a free process defense. So he's going to call it a defense, not a theodicy. All right, so let's get into these three things. He said first, his ultimate goal is to show that creationists have a better explanation for natural evil than theistic evolution. So he says, all right, here are the theses, here are the points that a theistic evolutionist is going to make. One, there were no individuals, Adam and Eve, who were the progenitors of the whole human race. Okay, so by the way, these are really good points to know. So if you're ever talking to somebody who says he or she is a theistic evolutionist, they will hold to these beliefs. So number one, there was no Adam and Eve. They'll say that there were maybe a minimum of 5,000 individuals. Number two, there was no fall of humanity at a point in time from innocence into sin. Okay, so no fall. Third one, the evil that we see can't be attributed to a fall. There's no curse on creation after a fall. Number four, during all these billions of years of our planet Earth's existence and life on Earth, that things that have come about, natural cataclysmic events with pain and death, have necessarily accompanied and sometimes have driven the evolution of life. And finally, number five, here's their last point. In light of these above theses, natural evil is seen as inherent in the way God chose to create. You don't need a defense. God used this. And he gives a quote from a theistic evolutionist. God, it seems, has chosen to use an evolutionary process to create the world, even though it's replete with suffering, death, and extinction. And then asks the question, why? And just says evolution is not only the sole available option, but maybe the only way to give rise to beings that someday will populate heaven. So, bottom line, as he quotes from Dembski here, evolution, with or without God, does nothing to mitigate the problem of evil. So, he says, we do have responses from creationists to this. He takes young earth creationists first. They say that evolution is impossible because they believe the universe, everything is maybe 10,000 years old. So evolution is impossible. And there was a first human pair, Adam and Eve, and there was a fall, and human sin is responsible for the suffering and death out there in the natural world, not God. And he said, you got old earth Christians, and they also believe that you have a much better defense against the theistic evolutionist perspective. So he said one standard defense against the problem of moral evil is called the free will defense. And he said how it might be possible in this case. So he's going to start off with the claim that the chaos that's built into our world, chaos systems, make natural evil possible. Then he argues that God may well have good reasons to make a world that does have chaos in it, even with the possibility of natural evil. And then he'll claim that even God can't make such a world where natural evil never occurs. Okay, so stage one, that free process defense goes like this. So, what's going on out here in the world, he says, the natural world is dynamic, and it's got interacting dynamic systems that are sensitively dependent on initial conditions. And if things happen to the system, just slight differences and disturbances, they lose equilibrium, they become erratic. And erratic systems can cause natural evil. And then he explains all that, but I'm going to skip all of that information here. So he said, like here's an example of what he's talking about. Try to balance a broom in the palm of your hand with the handle down. It says first you can keep the broom stable. Sooner or later, the initial conditions of the system will change either because we move our hands or there's air currents, and you have to make larger and larger corrections until finally you lose it, and there comes the broom. So he said, let's look at my premises here. So he said, I'm saying the world is made up of a vast number of interacting chaos systems. He says, but is it? Yeah. He says, definitely. He says, chaos systems abound. He gives just one area, weather. He says, we got weather patterns. He said, electrical impulses that go through heart muscles, the fluctuations of the stock market, the firing pattern of neurons in the brains. He goes on and on. They're all sensitive systems that depend on initial conditions. It's a dynamic world. And he said these systems can go out of control, and when they go out of control, we can end up with natural evil. So he said, for example, again, let's look at weather. You can get weather changing, and it'll disturb crops and do all sorts of things. Okay, so let's move on through the chapter here. And then the second part of his argument says, well, if you have a dynamic world where these chaotic patterns can happen, he says free creatures can exercise creativity in them, and that brings about novel effects. That's way better than a static world. And God would want to create a dynamic world. So he says it's pretty easy to defend the idea that a dynamic world is better than a static world. And so he spends some time talking about that, and I'll skip over some of that. So he said, think about the idea that God wants a dynamic world. He said, look at Genesis 1. God brings order out of the chaos, and he tells the humans there to exercise responsible stewardship. And that makes it sound like humans can affect the natural world. So it must be a dynamic world that will respond to human activity. I think that's a good point. He says if natural evil were not possible in that world, it'd be a world in which things like natural science and engineering, even education, would be vacuous. Courage and excitement would be absent. No real harm would occur. Careful structural design, forget it. It'd be meaningless because you'd have no earthquake or tornado. Medical arts, well, you wouldn't have disease, harming, or killing, so there'd be no medical arts. He says it really would not be a world worthy of rational, creative agents, even if you could live in it. So I thought that was interesting. Toward the end of the chapter, he says, all right, so somebody's going to say, great, well, why couldn't God have made a dynamic world that never goes out of whack? Remember, he said that there's chaos in our systems that can change and create some problems. So he said, God cannot make a dynamic world in which natural evil could not occur. He says, God can't do something contrary to his perfect nature. He can't commit suicide. He can't break promises. He says we ought to be thankful that he has a perfect nature and can't do that. But he said God can't do what's logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle. He can't make 5 + 7 = 13. So the question is this: can God make a dynamic world where natural evil isn't a possibility? He said no. He said God created a world as an open system of cause and effect, granted self-sufficiency to nature to operate according to these laws that he designed. So unfortunately, in that world, the wind could blow a tree down, and God would not be the direct cause. Now he's got a final section here where he wants to connect natural and moral evil. So he wants to suggest that both human and demonic agents can cause natural free processes to become chaotic. So he says, let's take that demon idea. He says Augustine and C.S. Lewis actually invoke satanic forces as causes of natural evil. Here's what C.S. Lewis said. It seems to me a reasonable supposition that some mighty creative power had already been at work for ill on the material universe, or the solar system, or at least the planet Earth, before ever man came on the scene. and that when man fell, someone had indeed tempted him. If there is such a power as I myself believe, it may well have corrupted the animal creation before man appeared. Alvin Plantinga says something like that. Satan is a mighty non-human spirit who was created long before God created man. Unlike most of his colleagues, he rebelled against God and has been wreaking havoc wherever he can. The result is natural evil. He says, so this is Plantinga, so the natural evil we find is due to free actions of non-human spirits. I think that's really interesting. So he said, it's very plausible, back to the author now for this section of the book, it's plausible that the spiritual fall of Satan may have brought about the physical effects on earth. Maybe that, those systems that God set up, maybe that brought in the first disturbances that he had created in equilibrium, and it made chaos part of what we have today. So he says it's definitely plausible that some of the evil that we deal with is a result of activity of Satan and his hordes. But he says human activity could also be responsible. I mean, think about the ignorance that's out here, our inattention, our arrogance, or evil. We can affect the natural world. I mean, he gives examples. Deforestation, overgrazing, poor land management. What's that done? It's created all sorts of problems in sub-Saharan Africa. How about overuse of antibiotics? We've ended up with drug-resistant bacteria. How about overfishing out in the Atlantic? The whole cod population collapsed. And said, we've done these things over and over, all because of our ignorance, our inattention, our arrogance, maybe even evil intentions. Maybe it's greed. So the failure of humans to act wisely as God's steward could lead to natural evil. And so you've got humans or you've got possibly demonic activity. And so what's happened is you had a dynamic system that was set up and it got disturbed and it had harmful consequences. He says, finally, it's at least logically possible that thoughtless, ignorance, or selfish human behaviors are leading to things like global warming. So climate change might be a purely natural phenomenon, and the suffering it might cause would be a natural evil because of free processes that are pushed to disrupting this equilibrium. So, conclusion. He says he's tried to show in this article how a world with a vast array of these systems, he calls them chaos systems, makes natural evil possible but not necessary, and that God might have had good reasons to create such a world. And he suggests some of that evil may be due to moral agents, whether demonic or human. So he said, consequently, old earth creationists have an explanation to come up with why natural evil is around. It was created by God in a very good state of equilibrium. God's not responsible, as he must be in a theistic evolutionary model. He's not responsible for natural evil. At the very end, he says we can do all this philosophizing, but we must not forget the suffering and grief caused by natural evil. And we have to remember there's much in the world today that's good and lovely and worthy of admiration. So he said even when there's a lot of suffering and things going on, the world still reflects the glory of the Creator. Well, that was maybe not the easiest chapter to go through, but this book has so much to think on, to think about. It's got just some wonderful chapters to stir our thoughts and make us ponder things. So it's called Theistic Evolution, and I think it does a nice job. I'm just seeing more and more Christians getting involved with theistic evolution. I'm not sure why. I think they're trying to adapt to evolution, to throw a Christian sheen on top of it, and I don't think it works. And plus, evolution itself is having some problems. A lot of people are starting to get off the evolution bandwagon just when Christians are starting to hop on it. So, bad news. Anyway, I appreciate you joining me today, and hope you're having a good day. We'll do another podcast soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.